Mr. President, for many years, the European Union, including at the UN, has managed to position itself as the main peacemaker and mediator, defender of international law, conductor of universal human and democratic values and human rights, as well as a selfless benefactor of developing countries, most of which, however, have been plundered by Europeans for centuries. However, now all these double standards and hypocrisy are rapidly coming to the surface. Instead of going for a good-faith dialogue and building a common security architecture in Europe, as Russia has proposed more than once, European countries nurtured Russophobic sentiments in Ukraine, incited it to go to war with Russia, regardless of the fate and lives of ordinary people, systematically torpedoed the negotiation process and continue to actively do so. The same Ms. Kaja Kallas, when she was Prime Minister of Estonia, said that Russia's defeat is not so bad. She argued that it is not so bad if a big power becomes smaller. Perhaps while promoting its mediation efforts around the world, Brussels also has its own ideas that someone should become smaller or bigger. As for international law, we have taken note of the calls contained in the final document of the European Council meeting on March 19th to respect the right of nations to self-determination. The EU members have once again shown their duplicitous nature. They remembered the principles of the UN Charter in their entirety and interconnection only when it came to Greenland. As for the population of Crimea and other new Russian regions, this topic is an absolute taboo for them. And the irony here is that the EU, which invented and long promoted the concept of a rules-based world order as opposed to international law, has now become the object itself, not the subject of its own deceitful concept. The same applies to freedom and safety of navigation. The European Council demanded their provision in the Strait of Hormuz, but at the same time, it is trying to restrict the movement of ships carrying goods in the interests of our country by force. By imposing democratic standards on UN member states, elections in the European Union itself have become a testing ground for working out political and information technologies. Within the EU, the stake is on preventing the strengthening of the positions of alternative political forces. Any means are used: censorship, control over the digital space, outright pressure, persecution, demands to review the wrong election results. We have recently seen all this in Romania and Georgia. We will see it more than once. With regard to third countries, one task is at the forefront: to preserve or bring to power the political forces that are as loyal to Brussels as possible. The corruption that Europeans are so fiercely seeking in the global south is flourishing within the European Union itself. The scandals that have come to light in Europe over the past year, including those involving former EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy Federica Mogherini and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, are only the tip of the iceberg. As for the latter, I would like to remind you that the ruling of the European Court of Justice directly refers to attempts by the head of the European Commission to conceal evidence of corruption. A real mutual cover-up also operates in the transfer of tens of billions of euros as part of assistance to Kyiv, most of which eventually ends up in the pockets of the European bureaucrats themselves. Is the EU's development assistance selfless? Most of our friends tell us that the new trend is that it is driven by a refusal to cooperate with Russia. The European Union has also demonstrated complete irresponsibility in matters of food security, when, due to anti-Russian sanctions, the countries of the global south faced unprecedented difficulties in acquiring Russian and Belarusian fertilizers and food. We are talking about the disruption of supply chains and problems with payments, insurance, and delivery of agricultural goods and fertilizers. EU functionaries claim that they have provided for appropriate exemptions from restrictions on trade in agricultural products, but they are silent about the fact that they exist only on paper and in fact do not work, being not binding on the EU member states. It is not uncommon to hear representatives of the EU and its member states trumping the fact that Europe is one of the main donors to development programs, including those implemented under the auspices of the World Organization. In 2024, they have collectively allocated about $16.6 billion to the UN system, $12.7 billion from EU member states, and almost $4 billion from the EU-wide budget. At the same time, a closer look reveals that all this so-called development assistance, including within the framework of the EU's Global Access Initiative, is designed to guarantee Brussels privileged access to natural resources. All investment and infrastructure projects implemented by the European Union under a plausible pretext are in fact aimed primarily at serving the interests of Europe itself. Mr. President, the Europeans now clearly do not have enough time for what Friedrich Merz called regulatory surpluses at the Munich conference, that is, in fact, creating a moralizing cover for their policy. All the forces of the European Union are now thrown into inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia. The EU continues to do everything to further escalate the conflict in Ukraine, including by intensively pumping the Kiev regime with weapons and military equipment in violation of its own export control criteria and international obligations. This makes him and his member states accomplices in the crimes and terrorist attacks carried out by Ukrainian militants using these weapons. At the same time, fearing dissatisfaction from President Donald Trump, European bureaucrats and their Ukrainian puppets pay lip service to US mediation initiatives. However, in fact, they are sabotaging the implementation of any realistic agreements. They are gushing with deliberately impassable and sometimes frankly absurd conditions, none of which takes into account Russia's fundamental concerns and cannot contribute to achieving sustainable and lasting peace. The latest example is the so-called Kallas Ultimatum, which is a list of absurd demands to Russia, without which the EU does not intend to allow Kiev to reach a peaceful settlement with Moscow. In fact, European officials reject the very idea of a diplomatic settlement and are openly promoting war while increasing the sanctions pressure on our country, which has not only proven to be ineffective, but has also caused colossal damage to the EU countries themselves and has already led to inflation and a serious drop in real incomes of ordinary Europeans. Damage is also caused to other countries. Weapons supplied to the Kyiv regime on paper subsequently surface in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Thanks to their efforts in the European Union, Ukraine has become the largest center of illegal arms trafficking. According to the calculations of the American Institute for the Study of War, every third machine gun that fell into the hands of extremist and terrorist groups around the world is of Ukrainian origin. Mr. President, Russia is fully aware that we are on the same continent with European countries. Geography cannot be changed, and history cannot be rewritten. Although Ms. Kallas's outstanding historical knowledge attributed to Russia as many as 19 wars allegedly initiated by Russia, not counting the African ones, and only in the last 100 years, for decades we have been advocating an equal, mutually respectful dialogue, mutually beneficial cooperation, and taking into account security concerns. This is necessary not only for Russia, but also for Europe. As German Chancellor Helmut Kohl said in 1993, the future of Europe, if it wants to survive as an independent center of civilization, must necessarily be together with Russia. We naturally complement each other, we will work with each other, and we will develop. If this does not happen, Europe will gradually disappear. This is what we see with our own eyes today. However, there is now a significant shortage of politicians of this magnitude in Europe. The current generation of European bureaucrats is convincing the population of their countries of the inevitability of a direct military clash with Russia and is feverishly preparing for war with it. Moreover, we are well aware that rabid Russophobes from the Baltic countries are behind this information war. Their transfer of their national Russophobic complexes to the EU-wide level became possible after they appropriated the development and implementation of the EU's Eastern course. The myth that bloodthirsty and cruel Russia poses an existential threat to Europe and that it is about to disappear is widely promoted. Militaristic anti-Russian rhetoric is supported by concrete practical actions. From February 2022 to 2025, EU member states increased defense spending by almost 60%. At the end of last year, allocations reached €381 billion, which is the second place in the world after the United States. Officially, the task has been set to increase Europe's defense capability by 2030. While increasing military allocations will be possible only as a result of reducing spending on other budget items, primarily social ones. These large-scale military preparations leave no doubt that Europe is seriously engaged in preparations for a major war against Russia. This is nothing more than playing with fire, since we will be forced to react to anti-Russian attacks in a mirror manner. And none of the conquerors who came to us with a sword, and there are countless of them, left Russia in good health. Such an overtly militaristic course is far less surprising if one looks closely at those responsible for formulating it. Some comments are so absurd and ridiculous that it would be quite appropriate to raise the question of the total professional unsuitability of their authors. In particular, the head of European diplomacy, speaking at a conference of the EU Institute for Security Studies last year, commenting on Vladimir Putin's speech at the celebrations in China, said the following: Russia turned to China and said, "Russia and China fought in World War II. We won World War II. We defeated Nazism." And I thought, this is something new. If you know the story, it raises a lot of questions. And this is said by the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs, who obviously knows nothing about the fact that it was the peoples of the Soviet Union and the Celestial Empire who took the brunt of the Second World War, suffering heavy human losses. Still, we would very much like to meet the history teacher of Mrs. Kallas. To sum up, I would like to say that apparently the EU is moving from the beautiful post-war idea of a united Europe in transit through the blooming garden to the construction of another Reich. We hope that both in the European countries themselves and in the international community as a whole, there are still sober heads who understand the risks and are ready to prevent such a development of events. Thank you for your attention.